Hey everybody, this is Travis Fritts from Old Nation Brewing Company. We're doing a little bit more of an in-depth video about yeast for folks that might be interested. We just made a 3-minute video that talked about the difference between ale and lager yeast, but I really like to nerd out about this stuff and that wasn't really satisfying. So we're making a bigger one for you folks that might be interested in hearing more about it. When we talk about yeast, what I'm really talking about, and I think what a lot of professional brewers are talking about, is that yeast is sort of the real brewer, which means I can mill grain, I can mix it with water, I can add hops, I can boil the resulting sugary liquid called wort, I can cool that down and send it to a fermenter. But without yeast, no fermentation happens, and we're just left with a great way to attract microbes and bacteria that is just a really sugary, not particularly delicious beverage. So yeast really is the focus to most professional brewers. It is where sort of the rubber meets the road in terms of what it is that we're actually trying to get done here. And this whole thing is going to be sort of focused on that. So let's get started. So we think that people encountered yeast and began to make beer around 9,000 to 10,000 years ago. That doesn't mean it wasn't happening 30,000 years ago. That means that the earliest evidence we have of containers being used for fermentation, meaning they have a bunch of yeast and like calcium oxalate and a bunch of other byproducts of fermentation, come from what is now China and sort of the near Middle East, in that range, somewhere between 9,000 and 10,000 years ago. What probably happened is that those folks didn't know, well, they almost certainly didn't know about microbes. They didn't know there were little microscopic unicellular fungus or animals or whatever that were running around, making, what would later be known as something like sauerkraut, or making bread dough rise, or fermenting sugary liquid into beer. But they did know that something was happening. And they certainly knew that if you left a bowl of sugary liquid out for a couple of days and then, drank it of an evening, the pace of that evening would certainly change. So we don't know what they knew exactly or what they didn't know specifically, but I think it's pretty fair to say that they knew something was going on. And they certainly knew that if they took the foam that ends up on the top of a fermenting beverage, or the yeast that settles to the bottom of the container that fermenting beverage was in, and transferred it to another fresh batch of sugary water, whether that was smashed grape juice, or honey mixed with water to make mead, or soaked cereal grain, which is what we now call beer, that transferring would ultimately and over time select for yeast that, what we know now as yeast, that behaved better in that location. And this happened for thousands of years. So this kind of unintentional hybridization that was happening selected over those thousands of years yeast strains that are at least echoed in what we use even now. So I think it's easy to say that, they thought that this was magic, or they thought that it was God, or they thought that it was spirits of their ancestors or whatever. And that makes a really good story, and it may absolutely be true. For example, one of the things we know from Mesopotamia, where beer was a form of payment for work, was that one of the earliest beer recipes that we have was written as a hymn to their goddess of beer, who was named Ninkasi, incidentally. So this kind of unintentional hybridization resulted in what we now refer to as domesticated yeast, right? Yeast where we know more or less what it looks like or how it'll behave in a lab, and there may be thousands of these kind of strains, but we've isolated them now. But we know more or less what it'll give us in a finished beer, given the right conditions. We kind of can predict what outcomes will happen. That almost certainly was not true for these folks, except for in a really general sense. But as beer kind of flowed through geographically from kind of the near Middle East, what's considered the Fertile Crescent in history classes, up through into Northern Europe, some really interesting things started happening, right? Beer became central to the diet of Europeans. That is to say, it was a sustainable and storable source of calories, but it would have been a lot different than what we drink now. So because they hadn't really isolated yeast yet, There might have been other microbes that were also fermenting the beer, which might have made it sour, or, in the case of a bad batch, maybe even vinegary. But one thing they found out was that the alcohol, the ethanol that yeast produces, even in pretty low concentrations of like 2% or so, would make it so that no human pathogens could live in the beer, which you hear about when we talk about the Mayflower coming over from Europe to the United States, et cetera, that they were drinking beer because they knew it wouldn't make them sick. So that's another kind of important way that yeast sort of influenced the way that we travel, the way that we traded, and most importantly, I think, influenced the way that we think about brewing beer, because when you are shipping it to other folks who are getting it, over long periods of time and long distances, they still expect for it to taste the same way. So I guess my point here is that even though those early brewers, and really brewers up until the late 1800s, may not have been able to tell you, what yeast looked like under a microscope or how many different strains there were or whatever, they certainly knew that transferring yeast, or what we now call yeast, from batch to batch worked and gave them a more consistent product. They knew that the more they did that over time through generations of brewers, the more sort of characteristic that beer would be to their location. And from that, obviously, cities that were famous for making beer and routes of cities that were trading beer a lot became, something that further influenced the development of beer, which we'll get into now. So all of that hybridization, right, over decades and centuries and millennia, ended up at some point, it's difficult to say exactly when, but it ended up in what we now call ale yeast. And the technical name for that yeast is Saccharomyces, or Saccharomyces if you're from Europe, cerevisiae. And what that means, if you kind of roughly translate it, it bounces back and forth between two different languages, but what that roughly means is sugar mold for grain, right? So our ale yeast is really just basically recognized as the yeast that makes beer. There are tons of different ale yeasts, but they all sort of come from this same root. That yeast is a top fermenting yeast, which means as it ferments the beer, it tends to rise to the surface and make a really dense and deep foam. That's one way you can kind of identify whether it is an ale or a lager yeast, although it's not always true, so it's not super dependable. But that yeast was really brewer's yeast for a long time. And as I say, different geographical regions would have slightly different variations of the cerevisiae yeast that would give slightly different characteristics to the beer that it made. But for all intents and purposes, it was really one kind of yeast. At this point, we know that's at this point, like in 2026, we know that there are two main subgroups of yeast, which we touched on in the short video. One is this Saccharomyces cerevisiae. We still use it. And again, there are hundreds and even thousands of different kinds of offshoots from that. But the other one is lager yeast. And that now, its technical name is Saccharomyces pastorius, Saccharomyces pastorius. And that is named that because Louis Pasteur, although he didn't discover yeast like a lot of folks think, did isolate this kind of yeast. His studies were more about preventing other microbes from interfering with the job that yeast did, which is why you have to ask for a sour beer, especially now, as opposed to just all beer being different versions of sour. Now we're kind of fast forwarding, which sounds weird to say, to 1850 or so, when Louis Pasteur, who's famous for inventing pasteurization, but was a brewing microbiologist sort of by trade, begins to do research into what really makes fermentation tick. His primary goal was not necessarily to identify yeast or to categorize yeast or any of that stuff, at first at least. His main goal was really to find what that is involved in a normal brewery's fermentation. That is to say, what microbes actually give us what we want and which ones do not, right? And so the ones that do not, that either give us something that we don't want or don't seem to have much effect at all, we can get rid of, and the ones that do, we'll keep. And so that process, even though it seems weird to say it now, kind of resulted in him saying, okay, well, yeast is what we want and everything else we really don't want. And that is, I mean, he certainly got farther than that, but that was the bulk of what was important in his research. Another brewing microbiologist named Emil Hansen, who worked for the Carlsberg Brewery, was the first person to actually isolate yeast cells and begin to sort of give them the things that we would give any microbe, right? What do they look like? How do they operate? What are the differences? All that kind of stuff. So these guys in the early 1880s, Louis Pasteur and Emil Hansen, were both brewing microbiologists that were really working kind of, not together, but sort of on the same stuff at the same time. So what did that mean, right? What it meant was this. There were a ton of regional styles at this time. There was, for example, and again, we're talking about the 1880s, so there was even spruce beer in North America, right, where we were using spruce tips instead of hops. It wasn't super popular, but it existed. There were, and again, we're even going back a little bit to maybe even the late 1700s, but there was Gose in Germany, for example, this kind of salty, sour beer, all different kinds of beer, but really difficult to sell, right, without the idea of exploration, right? People just wanted beer that they could drink and enjoy. And so they became accustomed to, or over time, they became accustomed to beer that really just was a lot like the beer we have now. So it had to go from the brewery to the place where folks were drinking it very quickly before it spoiled. All this kind of stuff needed to happen in order to give people this kind of more uniform experience that they were looking for from beer that was less regional and less sort of, again, sourness and smokiness, and flavors that were almost always associated with beer started to fall away, and we got to the more modern version that we're used to now. Lager yeast now becomes a real powerhouse, right? Because lager yeast, more than any other kind of yeast, is the kind that really is going to express exactly the raw ingredients that we're putting into beer. I mean, as we talked about just a couple seconds ago, this kind of uniform idea of what beer can be becomes what everyone is looking for. And nothing does that better than lager yeast. And now if we're in the 1880s, late 1800s, and moving through the 1900s up until the 2000s where we are now, it's just kind of a normal organic development, right? Lagers become 90% today of the beer that is consumed worldwide. Obviously, there are varying degrees of quality within that lager, but it is still lager, right? Whether it's Anheuser-Busch or Jever in Germany, or Pilsner Urquell in the Czech Republic, or Polar in South America, or Tranquillus from a craft brewery, it is by far the preferred yeast for commercial brewers to use to make beer. Unfortunately, what that's resulted in for a lot of American drinkers is a reference to our sort of industrial American lagers as what lager is. And that's kind of true in a way. It's difficult to argue because these industrial lagers are made to do whatever the platonic ideal of lager yeast is, right? No character, no real contribution to the beer, but unfortunately, there aren't those kind of nuances of soft grain flavor and spice of hops and balance through fermentation of sweetness and real attention to what makes water different as opposed to what makes water and the resulting beer just kind of inoffensive. And so our perspective, and by the way, I'm not saying these beers are bad. They definitely have a time and place. But I think for us as folks from the US, our perspective has been for a really long time that your kind of training wheels beer that you start out with, these sort of American lagers, are what lagers are, and they are absolutely not. It is true that, the yeast getting out of the way and allowing the brewer to really sort of manipulate fermentation to get the beer that they want that represents the raw materials that they use the best is not represented in those beers. But the idea of more control for the brewer and a more composed beer at the end of the day is really what lager is about. And people are talking about lager a lot more now, which makes me happy. I've been brewing lagers I'm 46 years old. I've been doing them for 26 years, coming from Germany back to here, sort of in the middle of the craft beer revolution. It has been difficult. I've probably spent millions of dollars trying to turn people on to different lagers, and the market here just not being ready. So, or people just not being as interested in lager. And every time I hear someone say, hey, I'm really getting into lagers, hey, this is the year of the lager, whatever it is they're saying, it makes me extraordinarily excited to make more lager beer for you all. But it's tough because lager beer doesn't have the same hook that ale does, right? I can point to our M43, our New England IPA, and say, you know, it tastes like orange rind and grapefruit, and it punches you right in the nose with everything it's got. It has a pillowy, soft mouthfeel that comes from oats, and I have so many different tools to work with in that beer. It makes it super easy to tell folks like you and everybody else what it is and what makes it different. When it comes to lager beer, it's a lot more nuanced, and it takes a 10-minute video like this talking about thousands of years of history to kind of come to the point. But the point is this: as a brewer, that's why lagers are interesting. They're interesting because you as a brewer get much more control over the end product, and you're able to much more carefully control and manipulate it at every phase of its production to end up with the beer that you want. This is quite often why myself and a lot of other professional brewers will walk into a brewery and get their lightest beer, because we can tell a lot about the brewery and the brewer from tasting that beer. How much do they care about fermentation? How much do they care about technique? How professional are they really? It's not that anybody can throw a bunch of stuff into a kettle and end up with a big, huge imperial stout that everybody likes. But after, 20 some years of doing this professionally, I can tell you it's a lot easier to do that than it is to make a really composed Pilsner. And I'm excited to show you guys our version of that here this year in 2026 and the rest of the lagers we make, in addition to all the really exciting ales that we make. I appreciate you spending this whole time on what might be kind of a boring topic in principle. I hope I was able to clarify some stuff for you, and I hope that next time I can make it even more interesting and fun. Thanks.